presentation is going to talk about the MATLAB Reservoir Simulation Toolbox, which we develop here in the group in SynTef. And I'm going to also talk about the carbon sequestration modeling functionality that we have, and introduce you to the reference application that we've been developing for MathWorks, which can be downloaded for free from their website. So I'll give a very brief introduction to our MRST software. I'll tell you a little bit about the philosophy behind the software and how we set it up. A small introduction to the CO2lab module, which is the one that we will be using later. And then the main part of the presentation is going to be an introduction and a demo of the MATLAB carbon sequestration reference application. So the MATLAB Reservoir Simulation Toolbox, also known as MRST, is actually an open source set of tools written in MATLAB, which can be used for reservoir simulation. And initially, this project was started because we wanted a quick way of prototyping new models and new things that we were doing in reservoir simulation. So the idea of writing it in MATLAB is that we can very quickly change things in the code. So we could implement new models or run things very quickly, or use the debugger in MATLAB, stop the code halfway through, change something, and have a look and see what happens. So it's very useful to be able to do this. But we also have standard industry data formats. So if you want to just load an Eclipse deck, for instance, and run a full simulation, we have the tools for doing that and some high-level functionality for generating the models that you need, running the simulation, and plotting the results. So depending on how into the coding you want to get, you can either use this as a very in-depth platform for trying new models, or you can use it at a higher level and just run a simulation. Another good thing about this code is that we, in our research group, actually research state-of-the-art methods in reservoir simulation. And there's quite a short pathway between the research that we do and actually getting it into the simulator. So if we have quite a lot of state-of-the-art reservoir simulation methods that we can use and that are available for other people to use open source. The code is fully differentiable, and we also have C and C++ acceleration. So if we want to run bigger models, we can use a compiled backend, which means that we can run much larger models. We're not quite at industry speeds just yet, but we're very close and we're getting closer all the time. One thing about MRST that we're quite proud of is that it's used internationally. So it's used all over the world. Many people have downloaded the software. There's been a lot of master's and PhD theses which have been written using the software, and also hundreds of external scientific papers, so not just the ones that we've written ourselves. And we have 2 open access textbooks on the subject. And the first textbook describes an introduction to reservoir simulation and how to begin working with MRST. The second textbook, which is out any day now, contains more chapters about detailed functionality and more complicated in-depth models that we have. So a bit about the software. The way we've designed it is we have a modular design. So there is a small core MRST module, which is loaded for all simulations. And then depending on what you want to do with it, you can load different modules to use with the simulator. We also try to have in-source documentation, like in MATLAB. So if you want to know what's happening with the input parameters for a function, you can look at the code and see what's going on. And we have many, many examples and tutorials for each of the modules. So the easiest way, I think, to get into it is if you know what you want to do and you have a problem, then find the example that's closest to that problem, use that as a starting point, and modify it for your own purposes. And as well as that, because this is open source, we also have external modules that are contributed by other people from different institutions. And if anyone wants to develop their own module and contribute it as well, we're always very interested to hear what people are doing. So in the latest release of MRST, which is the MRST 2021B version, which we released in September, we have 60 additional modules. They're not all here, but I will list a few of them. So we have some modules for grid generation and coarsening. We have modules which help with the Eclipse input and output, so we can read in Eclipse decks and simulate on them. We have various solvers for upscaling and multi-scale solvers, consistent discretizations. We have modules that can do black oil simulation, we can do EOR and also compositional simulation. Various fracture modeling tools. We also have geomechanics, geochemistry and geothermal, unsaturated media, modules for dealing with multi-segment wells, CO2 storage laboratory, which is what we will talk about later, adjoints optimization and ensemble modeling, and visualization and flow diagnostics, and that's just some of them. So if you're really interested to see what we can do, I suggest you go to the website mrst.no, and then we will have lists of all the modules that we have and a bit more information about what each module does. So that was a brief introduction to the software. The module that we're going to be using is the CO2lab module. So in CO2lab, we use the vertical equilibrium modeling technique. So this means that this is a simplification that works very well for CO2 storage modeling and allows us to model large reservoirs very quickly. So the way this works is that for CO2, for the CO2 problem, we have CO2 injection into a saline aquifer, and the CO2 is much less dense than the surrounding water, and there's a large buoyancy contrast. So if this is the case, we can assume that the vertical change in the vertical fluxes, so the way that the CO2 moves upwards, happens at a much shorter timescale compared to how the CO2 moves horizontally. So then we make the assumption that actually this happens instantaneously, and we model numerically the horizontal fluxes, but we analytically calculate the vertical configuration of the fluids, so the thickness of the CO2, based on the results from the horizontal numerical simulation. So essentially what we're doing here is we're reducing the dimensions of the grid from being a 3D grid into a 2D grid. So we have far fewer cells that we need to run the simulation on, which means we can run large areas relatively quickly. And also there's been lots of research in the literature which shows that this is actually a good way to, a good approximation to use for the CO2 storage problem. One thing that's relatively unique about the CO2lab module also is that we have a lot of graphical user interfaces. So we can actually do quite a lot of the simulation using these interfaces, which isn't necessarily the case for all the modules in MRST. And we have quite an intuitive tool chain, so we can go from looking at large-scale regional CO2 storage estimates. So if you wanted to pick a reservoir out of a large set of things that you wanted to model very quickly, or if you so we can go from those large scale estimates, or then we can move on to more detailed static capacity estimates for a specific reservoir, and then we can also do some dynamic capacity estimates, and we have tools for doing that as well. As well as looking at these things, we can also do some optimization of injection wells and schedules. And I'm not going to have time to explain all the functionality. We'll go through, we'll show some of it. If you want to find out more about what the CO2lab does, you can go to the CO2lab page on our website as well. So finally, the MATLAB carbon sequestration application is what I'm going to show you a demo of next. And this has been set up to show some of the functionality that we have within MRST for CO2 storage, and it will show some of the graphical user interfaces. We will look at static capacity estimates and interactive simulations, and then also we will look at how we can do things using the graphical user interfaces and also interface programmatically in that. Okay, So now I'm going to show you my MATLAB session. Hopefully you can see this okay. So you can download the CO2 reference application from the MathWorks website. When you do that, you could get an M file, which contains all the code. But here I've just opened the M file as a live script. So there's actually quite a lot of links in the M file. And if you look at it as a live script, you can click through on these links and get lots of information. The other thing you need to do, as well as downloading the reference application, is install MRST. So to do that, you go to our website, mrst.no, and download a zip file, which contains all the things that you need. If you unzip the file and go to the directory that you unzipped it to, then you need to run the command startup, which will run the startup script. And this basically sets up all the paths that you need. See it a bit better, maybe. Sets up all the paths that you need to be able to load all the modules and use MRST functionality. When you run startup, you get this display, as you can see here. And you get a list of some useful things that you can do that are all hyperlinked. So for one thing, you could have a look at the examples by clicking on this link here. You can also have a look at some of the data sets that we have that we distribute within MRST. And this is quite a useful one if you want to look at modules that we have that you might be interested in using. So once MRST is set up and the CO2 reference application is open, we can run the first part of the script. So I'm just going to run this script cell by cell. So if I run this first section, what this does is it runs this line here where we're adding the modules that we're going to need. So the first module that we need is CO2lab. We also have this course grid module, which helps with some of the gridding. We have AD core, so AD stands for automatic differentiation, and this is quite a lot of the black oil functionality that we have is stored in here. And AD props helps us with some of the fluid properties. So now if I do MRST module list, you can see that we have these modules listed that we've just loaded. So the first part of the example looks at regional storage capacity estimates using a GUI called Explore Capacity. So I just run this line here, and this will load the GUI for us. And this is looking at the maximum theoretical storage capacity estimates. So if you have a reservoir and you could fill all the sections where you would get structural trapping with CO2, and then the rest of the reservoir will be filled with brine, but there will be maximum residual CO2 saturation in that brine, and also maximum dissolved CO2 in that brine. What is the capacity that you would have in that reservoir? So running the Explore Capacity GUI will set up, bring up a window that looks something like this. And we actually have preloaded here the Utsira formation. So within this GUI, we can load any formation from the Norwegian CO2 storage atlas. Currently, we don't have coded into this GUI the ability to load your own, but I think we're going to be able to do that very soon. And if anyone actually looks into the code, it's not too difficult to load your own model also. But here we're going to stick with the Utsira formation, which is the one that was loaded initially at startup. So you can see the grid on the left. This is just colored by caprock depth. We have various buttons here that can be pressed to have a look at different things. So if I click this here, we can look at the structural trapping capacity and structural traps. So these are all the structural traps colored in based on how much they can hold, how much CO2 they can hold. And there's a lot of things here that you can look at, and this is all described on the website, which you can find a link to in the live script. But I don't have time to talk through all of it now. The other thing you can see down here in the bottom right is a summary of the different trapping capacities. So we have the total trapping capacity is 108.41 gigatons. And then a little bit of that is structurally trapped. Most of it is actually residually trapped. And then there's a little bit that is dissolved. And you can play around with these sliders over here and see how that changes the trapping capacity. So for instance, if we wanted to reduce the residual CO2 saturation, we could move this slider down here, and then this will update these parameters here. So you can see that actually if you reduce this residual saturation, you'll reduce the trapping capacity quite a lot, and also these trapping capacities are reduced. But then, for instance, if we increase the amount of this solution that you can have, this will cause the total trapping capacity to increase a little bit. So the idea of this user interface is that you can play around with these parameters and see what that does to the trapping capacity. So that's the first GUI. Like I said, if you go to one of the links here on the web pages in the live script, you can find a lot of information about how this works and what all the parameters do. And there's also a video tutorial on how to use it as well. Okay, so moving on to the next part. So here we're going to look at trapping analysis again and calculate some static trapping capacities. So if I run this first section of code, I'm going to load the Johansen formation, which is a formation that we can get from the Norwegian Storage Atlas. And this bit of code also does a bit of plotting, so we can see the grid here. So this is the 3D grid. If we want to look at the vertical equilibrium simulation, we actually need a 2D grid. So we run this code here, and this line here, top surface grid, creates the grid that we need for running the simulations. Now you can see this is the same as the grid above, but the colored bit is the top surface grid, which is just a layer on the top. It's a 2D grid, but it contains information about the thickness of the reservoir underneath each cell. So what we're going to do here is run the trap analysis function, which looks at spill points and does geometrical considerations to look at how the CO2 would move within the reservoir. So analogous to if you had water that was flowing downslope on the surface and pooling at the bottom, the CO2 is less buoyant than the water that's already in the reservoir. It will flow up slope and pool at the top of the reservoir in the structural traps, the stratigraphic traps. One thing that this bit of code does is it uses the MATLAB BGL library, so it uses some graph algorithms from that. If you do not have that already installed, MRST will tell you how to install it. So you'll get a message in the command window, and it's just a case of copying and pasting the line that it tells you to copy and paste, running that line, and then MRST can automatically download this module, this library, and install it for you in the right places to be able to use it. So this trap analysis, we have now run it, and you can see the results here. We plotted them using this bit of code here. So this is the same Johansen formation, looking down plan view. The structural traps are shown in red. So we have some very large traps where CO2 would pool in very large quantities, and then quite a lot of smaller traps. So we can also have a look at the spill paths between the traps, so see how CO2 would move through the reservoir just based on these geometrical considerations. So I run this bit of code. This is the same plot of the same reservoir again, but it's been shifted by 90 degrees. You can see the red traps here. And the pathways between the traps are shown in black. So you can see how CO2 would be connected through each trap. We also have a plot down here showing the number of cells in a trap and the bulk volume. So we have a lot of traps that are quite small, don't contain very many cells, and have relatively small volume. But we also have a couple of really big traps up here. So that's one way to do it. We can also use the interactive trapping tool, which allows us to investigate the same thing, but a little bit more interactively. So now I've run this line of code. It will bring up this graphical user interface here. So this is also the same Johansen formation. You can see the grid here. I don't know if you'll be able to see, but there's a red line here which indicates where the well currently is, and you can click anywhere on the grid and that will move the well to that location. So here I put the well inside this trap, and you can see it's a trap because when you click the well there, it's coloured in grey. You can also see that if you injected from this point here, from this well here, this trap is coloured in grey, also this one and this one and this one. So all these 4 traps are connected via this well. If you look at this pie chart here, this gives you an indication of how much of the total storage capacity would be filled if you had your well at the location that you put it at. So with a well location here, we have 60% of the total trapping capacity, total storage capacity of the reservoir is used by this first trap that you inject into. 2% of the total capacity of the reservoir is accessed by these other traps that CO2 is migrated to, but 37% of the trapping capacity of the reservoir hasn't been utilized. So the reason for that is if we inject here, the CO2 is going to move upslope and it's going to access these ones here, but it's not going to move downslope to access these traps that are all around here. So we can have a look if we click here, perhaps. Now we can see that with the well there, we've accessed a lot more of the trapping capacity. Now 90% of the total capacity of the reservoir is accessed by migration trapping. So not the trap that the injection well is in, but the trap that the CO2 will have migrated to from the injection well. 7% is the amount that isn't filled, and 3% is the original trap, which there must be a very small trap down here where I've clicked the well into. So if you want to access more of the storage capacity of the reservoir, then this would be a better place to inject than up here, potentially. So that's some of the functionality of this GUI. There are also a few buttons here that allow you to change some of the visualization properties up here in the top left. But the one I wanted to show you is this button here, which says Sim. So this allows us to set up a very basic simulation based on where we have put that well at the minute. So here you can set some of the properties of the simulation, the CO2 injection rate and the pressure. And then we can also look at migration and ejection. So I'm just, for the sake of this demonstration, going to make very short injection time of 10 years and then a short migration time of 10 years also. So that means we will inject CO2 for 10 years at the certain rate, at this rate specified here, and then we will shut off the well and leave the CO2 to migrate for another 10 years. So when you click simulate, you get a window that looks like this. Don't know if it will expand very easily. So we have also a window that looks like this, which shows us how far the simulation is at. So you can see we have the grid here. This is our injection point, and this shows the CO2 saturation. So in the top left, I don't know if you can see my cursor. We also, in the bottom left, have the height of the CO2 column. Bottom right, we have 2 cross sections. So this top cross section is the blue cross section you can see in the grid above. And this one down here is the pink cross section that you can see in the grid above. So you can see as the simulation progresses, how the CO2 moves through the simulation, moves through the grid. The other thing that you can also see up here is a chart of the different types of trapping that we have. So this orange is the movable CO2, so the CO2 that's just free CO2 in the plume. We also have the CO2 that's in the traps. And then this green section is the residual trapping. It's not updating very quickly, this image, but usually as the simulation is progressing, this will increase and you'll see the amount of residually trapped CO2 increasing as the simulation goes, and the amount of movable CO2 decreasing that's in the plume. So at the end of 10 years, 10 years was the injection phase. At the end of 10 years, then we will move on to the migration phase. And so with the migration phase, we're not having any more CO2 injection. So the amount of free CO2 in the plume is not going to increase during this phase. The only thing is that it can be residually trapped or leak out of the reservoir. So this always seems to take a lot longer when I'm demonstrating it than it does when I'm not doing it. But I think we're nearly there. So this is kind of handy. So if you want to have a look at how things are moving during the simulation, and then you can also go back and change the parameters that you have and change the injection location and see how that changes your results, whether it increases the CO2 capacity or not, the different types of storage capacity or not. Okay, I think I will stop it there. I think I've explained what I wanted to explain. So this was the second GUI, the trapping analysis GUI. So now we move on to looking at how we can actually run a more in-depth and complicated simulation, but set up the parameters using the graphical user interface. So here we use the tool Explore Simulation. I would just run this line here, and this will load graphical user interface. That's similar to the one that we looked at before, except it's a bit more complicated. So here, again, we're loading the Utsira formation by default, which you can see here. And the coloring is the depth of the grid, and this green indicates that we have open boundaries around the edge in our simulation. So I think first of all, we're going to edit the simulation boundaries. So we click up here, edit boundaries, and we're going to put a closed boundary in. So I think I would like to put a closed boundary in going from here to here. When I click that, this gets colored in red. So this will set up our simulation so that these cells actually have a closed boundary and everywhere else has an open boundary. And you can do that around the grid where you would like to do it. The next thing I'm going to do is click outline traps down here. So now we can see where the structural trapping would take place, where you would get domes where CO2 would pool. And I'm going to put some wells in. So I click select well sites here. I'm going to put one well in here, just near where we put the closed boundary. I'm going to put one well in here. And then we can set up some of the simulation parameters, but I will leave them as they are. And I'm going to just click launch new simulation. So it's also possible to, this is a very simple model. There's no capillary fringe or dissolution. It's also possible to add these things in, but they might make your model a bit more unstable. It's a bit harder to get this to run as you want it to, because sometimes these properties that you might put in are not necessarily realistic. But when you run the simulation, you get a printout that looks like this. So this is updating as we're going through. And you can see from this injection well here, CO2 is migrating around, and then this injection well here, we also have some migration up to this boundary. But remember, we shut most of this boundary off, although CO2 may be able to reach around the sides. And then what we can actually see here is that this cell, this injection from this well is going to fill this trap first. And then hopefully what we'll see is that it will move up and fill these various traps also. And yeah, we can see how it goes to this trap and then moves here. And this is purely based on the geometry of the cap rock in terms of the migration here. You can also see that as the CO2 has reached this closed boundary, sort of migrated around and has ended up down here as well. So now this simulation has finished. I set it to run for this many years. And you can also tell that it's finished because when it finishes, it brings up this plot here. So here we can see the different trapping mechanisms that have been in use through time in the simulation. So first of all, we can see the residual trapping is shown in green. So as the simulation carries on, the residually trapped CO2, so the CO2 that's left behind in the pore spaces when the water invades, increases through time. We also see that the free CO2, so the CO2 that's just injected as a plume, decreases through time because after the CO2 injection stops, we have more residual trapping and we have more leakage. So you can see here that CO2 has actually left the model and this has increased through time. And I think this is probably around here somewhere, around the edge of our closed boundary. So this is quite a good way to interactively have a look at running a simulation and set up. It's quite an easy way to set up a simulation without having to go too deep into the code. You can just click where you want to well, click how you want the boundary to be, and set up some of the parameters and run the simulation. So this is very useful if you want to set up a simulation that way. The final thing that I'm going to show you is how to set up a simulation using the code, doing it more programmatically. So if you want any information or more information about all the functionality of the previous user interface, you can find a lot in the reference application and also via the website. So the final section, we're going to look at using the code to set up a simulation. And there's various papers that have been written on this particular model. You can see the links here in the description. And the first part that we're going to run is this part. And here we're setting up some properties that we need. So first of all, we need to set up some gravity, or tell gravity to be turned on, which is a slight quirk of the MRST software, but it's very useful to have this functionality to turn gravity off and on if you're doing different types of modeling. So we turn gravity on, and then we set up some of the CO2 properties and the water properties. The CO2 properties, we use this function CO2 props, which actually is based on the cool props library. We have tabulated properties from the cool props library for a range of pressures and a range of temperatures. And then we can read these off at the pressure and temperature that we desire. So here we're going to set up a reference pressure and a reference temperature. And then we want the CO2 properties at these pressures and temperatures, which we can get by using this function here. We also have compressibility for CO2. We set the water compressibility to 0. We have some rock compressibility. These are residual saturations, so information about the residual saturation. And also the capillary entry pressure we set here. And then we set some of the viscosity properties. So once we have set up that bit, then I will run this code section here. So this first line looks at making the grid. And in this case, we actually have a special function that looks at the Johansen grid and makes the Johansen grid into a VE grid and gives us the properties that we want. So this G structure is the grid structure. We have the rock, which is just a MATLAB structure with the entry for porosities and for permeabilities for each cell in the model. And then these two parameters are things about information about the boundary conditions. But these are specific to this grid. So if you wanted to use your own grid, if you had, for instance, an Eclipse deck, you can import the deck. We have lots of functionality for doing that within MRST and for setting up a simulation. So if you look on our website, you find more information about how you might be able to do that. So once we have the grid, now we need to look at the wells. So here we set some of the cells to be used for the wells. We also set the injection rate. So in this case, we're going to have one injection well, with a specific rate. It's also possible to have a well with a bottom hole pressure, but now we're just going to have one injection well. And once we've set the rate and we've said which cells in the grid we want it to be in, we're going to use this add well function, which is a function that is used throughout MRST. And we give this function the grid, the rock properties, and the well cells. We say what type of well it is, a rate well. We say what the injection rate is going to be. And then we also say what composition we want to be injected to have. So in this case, we want to inject CO2. So CO2 is the second index. So we set this to 1. The first index refers to the water phase, and we want that to be 0. We don't want to inject water. So that is one well. We also set up the grid as before using the top surface grid function. So we get the VE grid that we need. We also need some average rock properties. So we just do average the rock properties vertically for each cell. And then we also use this convert wells VE, which converts this well that we just put in into a VE well. So it calculates the well indices and adds all the injections together, so we have the correct setup for the well when we only have the 2D grid. The next thing we need to do after setting up the well and the rock is look at the initial state. So our initial state, we're going to have hydrostatic pressure throughout the grid, and we're going to be initially fully saturated with water. So the hydrostatic pressure we can set up like this. And the initial state, S, refers to saturation. And like I said before, we wanted the water index is the first index. So here we set the saturation of water to 1, and we set the CO2 saturation to 0. And then we also have the maximum gas saturation, which we need. And in this case, for the initial state, the maximum gas saturation is also going to be 0, because we haven't injected any CO2 yet. We don't have any initially in the well. So let's have a look at the grid that we just created. So this little bit of code, we'll just do some plotting, and we'll have a look at the grid and the well. You can see here, this grid is the VE grid shown in blue. We have an injection well, which is down dip right at the bottom of the reservoir here, and it's next to this hole. We also have shown the full grid in yellow underneath, and just shifted them a bit so that you can see the difference. But we'll be running the simulation on the blue grid. This section sets up the fluid model. So the fluid is quite easy to deal with in MRST because it is just a structure with different properties. And one good thing about this is that you can pass anonymous functions into it. So here for the rel perm, we have an anonymous function here, which we will use in the fluid structure. For the CO2lab fluids, we use makeVE fluid, which is a function that has quite a lot of different functionality for setting up different types of fluid. So in this example, we're going to have a capillary fringe based on upscaled sampled capillary pressure. It's possible to have other configurations, so you could just have a flat interface with no capillary pressure at all. And there's several other options. So I would suggest if you're interested in finding out what can be done, you can have a look at this function and have a look in the docstring in the code. You can find a lot more information. But here we use the makeVE fluid and we set all these parameters, which we calculated before, most of them, and that will give us a fluid structure that we need for the simulation. So this section is looking at setting up the boundary conditions and the schedule. I'll run this section here, stage, and then a migration stage. So in order to do that, we copy this schedule control. So we have 2 of them, but we set the value of the injection well to 0 in the second control. We also specify how many time steps we want and how long we want them to be. So we want 50 one-year time steps here, and then we want 25 time steps that last 10 years. So these are a little bit shorter than in the example that you can download, but that's to try and make it run a little bit faster for this demonstration. And once we've set up these time steps, we need to tell the schedule which control to use at which time step. So the first 50 time steps, we're going to use control number 1, which is the one with the injection. And the next 25 time steps, we're going to use control number 2, which is the one without the injection. So this section of code is the bit where we actually run the model. So I'll set it off running while I'm talking. So once we have everything set up like that, we need to create this, run this line to create this model. And this basically sets up the equations that we want to use, which are all stored within the functionality for this CO2 VE black oil type model. And we call this function using the grid, the rock, and the fluid. And then once we've done that, we can use this functionality here, simulate schedule AD, to actually run the simulation. So we have the initial state, we have the model that we just created with the previous line, and we have the schedule controls all the time stepping in the wells, in the injection wells. And running this line produces this output here as the simulation is running. So you can see what time step, which time step the simulation is on, and what time in the actual simulation that is. And as this goes through, we can see we're now on to 49 out of 75 time steps. So once this is finished, we will get some output, which will be in the form of the well solution and the states. So the well solution will tell us things like the bottom hole pressure in the wells and the injection rates. And if we had any producers, we would also be able to see how much of each phase they were producing, but that's not going to be the case for this simulation. We just have one injection well. And then the states contains the pressure and the saturation at each time step during the simulation. So now we can see the simulation is complete, and we solved 75 steps in 106 seconds. So finally, we're going to have a look at some of the simulation results. So if I run this code here, we can plot the result, and hopefully this will show up as an animation. So this is the CO2 saturation during injection, and we can see the yellow, there's a high CO2 saturation, and the CO2 is migrating up dip. And as it goes, we'll see that we get higher CO2 saturation where we have some bumps in the top surface. So where there are structural traps where the CO2 could stay in a thicker layer. So like, for instance, these green sections here. And then finally, after we've looked at the saturations, we can have a look at the trapping capacity. If I run this section here, we're basically trying to plot the same picture that we plotted before from using the graphical user interface. So in this one, we can see from the results what sorts of trapping mechanisms that we have. And actually, as time increases, we have more free trapped CO2 in the plume. Free CO2 in the plume. But we also have an increase in the residual saturation. So that is the end of the reference application I was wanting to show. I hope that's given you some indication of some of the functionality that can happen that we have. And like I said, there is a lot more information on the website, a lot more in detail descriptions of what all these user interfaces do. And there's also more functionality that we haven't been able to show here. So I'd encourage you to go and have a look if you're interested. We also have a user forum, which is it's monitored by us. So if you have questions, we quite often answer the questions, or we try as best we can to answer the questions there. If you need help with things, and there are also plenty of resources on our website for other things as well as the CO2 lab demonstration. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesca. We have 2 questions in the chat. I don't know if you've seen them. We've one from Ahmed from PDO. He wants to know what's the efficiency of the migration? How fast is the migration in comparison to the injection?
And the migration happens on a much longer time scale. So the injection here, for instance, in this thing, we were using 50 years of injection, but then we had 250 years of migration. So this sort of is slowly migrating up, but I mean, it depends on the properties of your reservoir, the permeabilities and things like that, and how fast you're injecting also.
So maybe a little bit more context with that with regards to the efficiency. So I would be interested to understand the buildup in pressure in the reservoir while you're doing that. So the capacity for the reservoir to actually take the injection, because you might get to a point where you're above fracture gradients, and then you're not, you're fracking the well instead of injecting the gas. And
Yeah,
that
so
might not be something that you want.
This is like highly dependent on the injectivity of the reservoir. So you can have like, I mean, it's possible to set the injection well so it's limited to a pressure. So you can inject at a certain rate, but if it reaches a certain pressure, it will switch off. And I mean, it also depends on what boundary conditions you have, what rocks you're injecting into, what the permeability is, how fast you're injecting. If you inject everything very quickly, obviously you're going to get a larger pressure buildup, so you might not want to do that. So there's also tools for looking at sort of optimizing the injection wells placement to try and limit the pressure buildup as well. So it's highly dependent on the reservoir, but that's why you do this simulation, to see where you want to inject, how fast you want to inject, what pressure you're allowed to reach. Does that help?
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you.
We have another question from Ronald Zika. What are typical data sizes in number of cells that MRST can deal with, and what is the limit?
That is a good question. I think this is increasing all the time, and it depends on what sort of models you want to use. So generally, I would say, I don't know, these are in like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. It is possible to run millions of cells, but not many millions. So I think someone was saying today they might have like if you were running an incompressible simulation and you had a very large computer, you might be able to get up to a few million cells, but that's not generally the size of grid we deal with. We're usually looking at tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. If you want to run larger models, we also have, I don't know if you've heard of OPM, which also looks at, well, it's designed to be able to take Eclipse type input and run larger models more efficiently. So that's more efficient than the MRST. I'm not sure what the CO2 modeling capacities are for that, but modeling functionalities for that. Hope that helped.
Another question from Bora. Can you import or export the grids and results from CMG or Petrel?
You can import Petrel if you can get an Eclipse type input, which I believe you can get from Petrel, then you can import that into MRST. So if you have like a .ecl file, you can read that in. I'm not so familiar with CMG export formats. But basically, yeah, we read in .ecl files. So if you can get it into that format, then you should be able to load it into MRST.
And one final question from Antonia. Is it possible to consider geochemistry and geomechanics in CO2 modeling? And if yes, how?
That is a good question, and it's more of a question for my colleagues because they work more in this. So in the CO2 lab, we don't really have any of the geochemistry in terms of other properties, so other chemicals apart from CO2. We have a compositional module which allows you to look at different compositions, but that's not specifically written in the CO2 lab, and it is not necessarily using this VE formulation. The geomechanics, we also have geomechanical modules. I don't believe there's anything in the CO2 lab at present, but I might be mistaken on that one. So perhaps if you ask in the forum, you'd get a more in-depth answer on that.
Great. Thanks very much, Francesca. If there's no other questions or anyone wants to come on live themselves, we'll leave it here. Great. So if there are any more questions that should pop up afterwards, you can email me or the team. I'll put it into the chat, and then we might be able to pass them on to Francesca if she doesn't mind. So, thank you so much, Francesca. It's been fantastic. So concise, so easy to understand, even for me, from my layperson point of view. So thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us today.